She had the wrong key. Not metaphorically, not in the way stories sometimes use the wrong key to mean something larger about belonging or access or the doors we aren't supposed to open. Literally, the wrong physical keycard assigned to the wrong floor by a front desk coordinator who had been on hour 11 of a 12-hour shift and had made one small, precise, completely understandable human error. Suite 4701. Floor had been given the card for 4017. She did not notice the difference until the door opened, and by then it was already too late. This is the story of Flor Reyes and a man named Elias Morrow, a woman who had spent 3 years learning the invisible architecture of one of the most expensive hotels in Dubai, who knew which guests wanted their pillows turned a specific direction, and which ones needed the blackout curtains drawn before 7, and which ones left a generous tip, and which ones left nothing but a mess. A woman who was very good at her job and very quiet about being good at it, which was, as it turned out, the specific quality that made the wrong suite the right accident, and a man who had not been surprised by anything in 4 years. Until a Tuesday evening in November when a blonde woman in a hotel uniform walked through his door looking at a checklist and said, without looking up, "Good evening. I'm here for your turn-down service." And he said, "I didn't request turn-down service." And she looked up. And the surprise on her face was so completely genuine, so entirely unperformed, that Elias Morrow, who had spent 4 years being approached by people who wanted something from him, and had learned to identify the wanting before they opened their mouths, recognized immediately that this woman wanted nothing. Which was, by a very wide margin, the most interesting thing that had happened to him all year. Elias Morrow was 36 years old, and had been described by the financial press in the specific way that publications describe black men who have built something extraordinary, which was with a mixture of reluctant admiration and persistent astonishment that he found, after a decade of it, no less tedious. The astonishment, specifically, the quality of surprise in the coverage that read underneath the professional language like a question that kept being asked without being asked directly. How? As if the how were more remarkable than the what. The what was this, a technology infrastructure company that had started as a logistics software firm in Lagos when Elias was 22. Operating from a single room with 2 developers and an idea that the continent's supply chain systems were being held back by technology that had been designed for markets that looked nothing like the ones it was being applied to. He had built something that fit. That was the whole idea. That was the stop importing solutions and build one that understood the actual problem. By 30, he had offices in 7 African cities and a client list that included 3 national governments. By 33, he had expanded into the Gulf. By 35, the London and Singapore offices had opened, and the company, which he had named simply Morrow Systems with the quiet confidence of a man who understood that the name would carry the weight of what came after it, was valued at a number that made the financial press write that specific kind of astonished story. He had read all of them. He had noted the astonishment. He had gone back to work. Dubai was his 3rd visit in 8 months. The Gulf expansion was the most complex phase the company had been through. Not because the technology was difficult, but because the relationship architecture required to operate across that many sovereign contexts simultaneously was its own sophisticated system. And Elias had learned early that the relationship architecture was always the real work. The technology was the easy part. People were the interesting problem. The Burj Khalifa view from Suite 4701 was not something he had requested specifically. He did not request views. He requested space and quiet and reliable Wi-Fi and the kind of service that understood that excellent service was invisible. You did not feel it. You simply found that everything you needed was already there. He had been on a call for 4 hours. The call had ended 40 minutes ago. He had poured himself 1 drink, which was his limit during working trips. and he was standing at the window looking at the particular quality of Dubai at night, which was unlike any other city's night because Dubai had decided to take the concept of illumination seriously in a way that most cities hadn't, and the result was a skyline that looked like someone had scattered light with intention rather than letting it accumulate. He was thinking about the morning's negotiation. He was not thinking about anything else. And then the door opened. Fleur had been at the Al Safa Grand for 3 years, and she had a system. Most people who were very good at service jobs had a system, though they didn't always call it that. It was the accumulated knowledge of patterns. Which rooms needed what, which guests were particular in which ways, which floors had the specific quirks of lighting or ventilation that required workarounds she had learned through repetition. Her system was so well developed that she could move through a turned-down assignment with the efficient grace of someone who had internalized the work so completely that it required almost no conscious attention, which freed her mind to do other things. She listened to podcasts occasionally through one earbud. She thought about her family in Cebu. She composed in her head the long, detailed letters she sent her mother every 2 weeks. She was thinking about her mother when she walked into Suite 4701. She was specifically thinking about her mother's birthday in December and the question of whether the amount she had saved was enough for the flight home, and whether she could ask for the time off given that December was the hotel's busiest month. She was thinking about this with sufficient focus that she had swiped the card, pushed open the door, stepped inside, clicked on the small foyer light, and said her standard greeting before she registered that the suite in front of her was not the suite she had been assigned. 4017 was a standard premium suite. Clean lines, understated. The kind of room that was excellent without announcing it. 4701 was the presidential. She knew the presidential. She had turned it down twice before in the rare occasions when it was occupied, and both times the guest had been absent and the work had been straightforward. She knew the size of it, the scale, the floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, the specific quality of the furniture, which was the kind of furniture that was so precisely right for its space that you noticed it without being able to say exactly why. She registered all of this in the half-second before the man at the window turned around, and then she registered him. Tall, dark, the specific quality of stillness in a large person that spoke not of slowness but of control. The deliberate containment of someone who had learned that the room waited for them and had stopped needing to fill the space with anything other than presence. He had a glass in his hand. He was in a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and the collar open. He looked like a man who had been working for a long time and had only recently stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "Good evening, I'm here for your turn-down service." He said, "I didn't request turn-down service." She looked up from her checklist. The moment that followed was approximately 4 seconds long and contained more information than most 4-second intervals in Fleur's professional experience. She understood immediately that she was in the wrong room. The size of the suite told her that. The man's expression told her that. The complete absence of this suite number from her assignment list, which she was now reading with the sharp focus of someone who had just understood the nature of their error, confirmed it entirely. She also understood in the same 4 seconds that the man looking at her was looking at her with an expression she had not encountered before in 3 years of service work. Not irritation, not the particular blankness of a very wealthy person encountering a minor inconvenience. Something else, something that was, she was fairly certain, interest. Genuine and direct and not managed into anything more socially comfortable. She said, "I'm so sorry, I have the wrong suite." She said it with the professional steadiness of someone who had been trained to handle awkward situations without amplifying them. Calm voice, appropriate apology, clear intention to resolve. She reached for the door handle. He said, "You're certain?" She said, "Yes." I'm very sorry to have disturbed you. He said, I'm not disturbed. She stopped. He said it with the particular quality of someone making a factual statement rather than a polite one. Not, don't worry about it. Not, no problem. Just a simple, direct correction of an assumption she had made. She looked at him. He was still looking at her with that expression, the interested one. He said, What suite were you assigned? She said, 4017. I apologize for the confusion. The card numbers are very... He said, Similar. Yes. She said, I'll go down and have the card corrected and... He said, Is there something waiting for you in 4017? She said, I'm sorry. He said, A guest expecting your service. Something time-sensitive. She said, No. The guest in 4017 checked out this afternoon. It's a preparation for tomorrow's arrival. He said, Then it isn't urgent. She said, Mr. He said, Morrow, Elias Morrow. She said, Mr. Morrow, I should still... He said, Stay. She stopped. He said it the way he said everything, apparently, which was simply and directly and without the surrounding architecture of softening language that most people used when they wanted something. Just the word. The request, clean and unambiguous. She looked at him. He said, I've been on calls for 6 hours. I'd like a conversation that has nothing to do with work. You walked in here with the wrong key and said the most honest thing anyone has said to me all day. She said I was here for your turn-down service. He said, You said it and you meant it. There was no agenda underneath it. Do you understand how rare that is? She said, I'm a housekeeper, Mr. Morrow. I'm not usually compared to your business contacts. He said, You should be. You could teach most of them something about honest presentation. She looked at him for a moment, the assessment of a woman who had dealt with many different kinds of guests and had developed of necessity a precise internal taxonomy of what kind of person she was in a room with. He was not a type she had a previous category for. She said, I can't stay, I'm on shift. He said, I understand. She said, and this is your private suite. He said, I know what it is. She said, Mr. Morrow. He said, Elias. She said, Mr. Morrow, I'm not sure what you're suggesting, but I want to be clear that... He said, I'm suggesting a conversation. That's the complete extent of it. You have the wrong key. The universe has given us 15 minutes. I'm proposing we use them. She looked at him, the long, clear look of a woman who had learned to read rooms and was now reading this one. She said, You're very direct. He said, Always. She said, Most guests aren't. He said, I've noticed. I find it wastes time. She said, And if I said I need to leave? He said, I'd say goodnight and thank you for the accidental company and call the front desk to let them know about the keycard error so you don't get in trouble for it. She said, That last part is... She paused, thoughtful. He said, It's accurate. You shouldn't be penalized for a system error. She looked at him. Something shifted in her assessment. The recategorization of a person who had just revealed something about themselves that they hadn't intended to reveal. He hadn't framed the keycard offer as a kindness. He had framed it as accuracy. That was a specific kind of person. She said, 15 minutes. He said, 15 minutes. She did not put down her service kit. That would have been a different kind of commitment. She kept it in her hand, the quiet signal of a woman who was staying briefly but had not forgotten where she was or what she was there for. He said, Sit down. She said, I'll stand. He said, You've been on your feet since. She said, 2 o'clock. He said, Sit down. She sat in the chair nearest the door, the chair of someone who had one eye on the exit and both feet on the ground. He sat on the sofa, the appropriate distance of a man who had said conversation and meant it. He said, What's your name? She said, Floor. He said, Floor. He said it the way people said names when they were actually hearing them rather than filing them. She noticed. He said, Where are you from? She said, Cebu, Philippines. He said, how long have you been in Dubai? She said, 4 years, 3 at this hotel. He said, you like it here? She said, I like the work. Dubai is. She thought about how to say it. Uncomplicated. Everything is what it presents itself as. There's no pretending it's something it isn't. He said, most people find that alienating. She said, I find it restful. I grew up somewhere very layered, where everything meant something else. He said, Cebu. She said, my family specifically, very large, very complicated, very loving in the way that's sometimes hard to tell from difficult. He said, I know that kind. She said, do you? He said, Lagos, large family, complicated, very loving in the way that sometimes required translation. She said, you're from Lagos. He said, originally. I've been based in Dubai for 2 years. London before that. Before that. He paused. Everywhere the work needed me to be. She said, you don't have a base. He said, I have an apartment in Lagos. I sleep in 6 weeks a year. That's the closest thing. She said, that sounds lonely. He said it with the bluntness she had already identified as his primary mode, not performing, just saying. He said, it is. I've made a reasonable peace with it, she said, because the work requires it. He said, because I chose the work. The loneliness is a feature of the choice. Pretending otherwise would be dishonest. She said, most people pretend otherwise. He said, I know. She said, you don't. He said, I try not to. She looked at him across the appropriate distance of the presidential suite. Elias Morrow, whom she had not known existed 40 minutes ago, who was sitting on a sofa in a rolled-sleeve shirt having the most honest conversation she had had in 3 years with a man she had walked in on by accident. She said, what do you do? He said, technology infrastructure, supply chains, logistic systems, data architecture. She said, and that requires you to be everywhere. He said, the markets are everywhere. Yes, she said, do you like it? The everywhere. He said, the work, yes, completely, the everywhere. She caught the slight pause, increasingly less. She said, why increasingly? He looked at her. The full attention of a man who was deciding how honest to be about a thing and arriving at the same answer he always arrived at. He said, because I'm getting older and the things I thought I didn't need, I'm starting to think I actually need and didn't know how to want correctly when I was younger. She said things like, he said stillness, consistency, the specific ordinary pleasure of being somewhere that knows you. She said, that's not something you have. He said, in Lagos, partially. Here, not yet. She said, you've been here 2 years. He said, the hotel knows me. My assistant knows my preferences. That's not the same thing. She said, no, it isn't. He said, you understand that distinction. She said, I'm in service work. I know people's pillowcase preferences, their minibar habits. Which ones take their coffee at 6 and which ones don't open the curtains until noon. I know all of that. It tells me almost nothing about who they are. He said, and yet you know. She said, the details accumulate. You start to see the shape of a person through the accumulation. He said, what shape do I have? She said, I've known you 12 minutes. He said, 14. She said, 14. That's not enough for a shape. He said, what do you have so far? She looked at him, the clear, direct look she had developed through years of needing to assess guests quickly and accurately and without projecting. She said, you're honest because it's efficient, not because you're warm. Though I think you might be warm also. He said, why do you think I might be? She said, the key card. You thought of it without being asked. That's not efficient, that's consideration. He was quiet for a moment. He said, you're observant. She said, it's the job. He said, it's more than the job. She said, yes, it's also me. He said, the job and you. She said, the job taught me to pay attention. I think I would have paid attention anyway. He said, what else do you pay attention to? She said, Mr. Morrow. He said, Elias. She said, my 15 minutes. He looked at his watch. He said, you have 3. She said, I know. He said, floor. She said, yes. He said, I want to be clear about something before you leave. She said, go ahead. He said, this was not what I was planning for this evening. I don't have an agenda underneath it. I wasn't looking for company, and I'm not. He stopped, searched for the right word. Collecting. She said, I know. He said, how? She said, because you said stay the same way you'd say the sun is setting, like it was a fact you were offering rather than a request you were making. People with agendas ask differently, he said. And you stayed. She said 14 minutes. He said, why? She said, because you were interesting and it's been a while since something was interesting. He said, the work isn't interesting. She said, the work is good. Good isn't the same as interesting. Good I understand completely. Interesting surprises me. He said, and I surprised you? She said, you said no, you're exactly where you belong, and you meant something completely different from what it sounded like. He said, what did it sound like? She said, like something a man says to a woman in a hotel suite in a way she should be uncomfortable with. He said, and what did I mean? She said, that the accident had a logic, that the wrong room was interesting rather than inconvenient. He said, yes. Exactly that. She said, I know. She stood. He stood. The natural conclusion of time announced by both of them simultaneously. She said, I should go correct the key card. He said, I'll call the front desk. She said, you don't have to. He said, I know. I'm going to anyway. She picked up her service kit, walked to the door. He walked with her, not performatively, just in the direction of the door because it was the direction they were both going and it was a natural thing to do. At the door, she stopped, turned. She said, Elias. He said, yes. She said, the shape. You asked what shape I had so far. He said, yes. She said, a man who is very good at being alone, who has recently started to suspect that being good at something isn't the same as it being right for you. He said nothing for a moment. He said, that's accurate. She said, I thought so. He said, how did you get that from 14 minutes? She said, 12 of them you spent telling me about what you don't have. People who are satisfied with their lives don't do that. He said, I wasn't complaining. She said, I know. You were just being honest. That's different. He said, it is different. She said, good night, Mr. Morrow. He said, Elias. She said, good night, Elias. He said, good night, Floor. She left. He stood at the closed door for a moment. Then he walked back to the window. Dubai was still doing its illuminated thing. The drink on the side table had gone warm. He didn't pick it up. He called the front desk, explained the keycard error. Was very clear that the staff member was not at fault. The front desk coordinator was apologetic. He said there was nothing to apologize for and that the system error should be corrected so it didn't happen again. Not to protect himself, to protect her. He hung up. He stood at the window for another moment. He thought, a woman who walked into the wrong room and told him 2 true things about himself in 14 minutes. He thought, the shape of a person through the accumulation of details. He thought, I've been in this hotel for 11 days and I know my minibar preferences and I know the front desk coordinator's name and I know the Wi-Fi password and I know nothing about what this city actually is. He thought, interesting. He went back to work. But the work, for the first time in a very long time, took slightly longer to absorb him than it usually did. Floor corrected the keycard at the front desk, finished her shift and took the staff elevator down to the basement level where the lockers were. She sat on the bench in front of her locker for a moment before opening it. She thought about a man who had said stay like it was a fact and meant it like a request. She thought about, "You're exactly where you belong." She thought about what he had meant and what it had sounded like and the space between those two things, which was, she had decided, in the elevator down, where the actual interesting thing lived. She thought about Cebu and her mother's birthday and the flight she was saving for. She thought, I have been in this hotel for 3 years, and I have turned down hundreds of suites, and I have known the pillow preferences of more people than I can count. And this is the first time I have sat in a suite for 14 minutes, not because the guest needed something from me, but because I needed something from the conversation. She thought, that's new. She thought, interesting is the right word. She opened her locker, changed, went home on the metro with the particular quality of a woman who was thinking about something she had decided not to think about too much. She thought about it anyway. 2 days passed. She did not expect to see him again. The presidential suite had no turn-down assignments on her schedule, and she had no professional reason to be on the 47th floor. She was good at her job partly because she understood the architecture of appropriate professional distance, and she had no intention of compromising that. She was on the 32nd floor on Thursday afternoon when the lift doors opened and he was in it. He saw her. She saw him. He said floor. She said Mr. Morrow. He said Elias. She said Elias. The lift was going down. She stepped in. The doors closed. He said, how is 4017? She said, the guest is happy with the service. He said, good. She said, how are your calls? He said, long. She said, the Gulf expansion. He said, yes. She said, is it going well? He said, slowly. Which is the correct pace for this kind of work but doesn't feel correct when you're in it. She said, most things feel wrong at the right pace. He looked at her. She said, my grandmother used to say that patience feels like punishment until it starts to feel like wisdom. He said, your grandmother was right. She said she was right about most things. She was also very loud about being right, which made it harder to absorb but easier to remember. He said, like a mother. She said, related. The lift arrived at the lobby level. He held the doors for a moment. He said, do you have a break? She said, I'm between assignments. 20 minutes. He said, the lobby cafe. She said, Mr. Morrow. He said, Elias. She said, we shouldn't. He said, we had a conversation 2 nights ago. This would be a second one. She said, in the suite it was an accident. He said, this would be a choice. I know the distinction. She said, do you understand why I'm hesitant? He said, your staff. I'm a guest. The hotel has policies. You're concerned about your position. She said, yes. He said, I'm not going to do anything that puts your position at risk. I want to be clear about that. She said, you can't promise that. You don't control the hotel's policies. He said, no. But I control my behavior and I know the line. The lobby cafe is a public space. Staff use it on breaks. There's nothing in that arrangement that is professionally inappropriate. She looked at him. She said, you've thought about this. He said, I've had 11 days in Dubai with 6 hours of calls per day. I think about many things. She said, did you think about me specifically? He said, since Tuesday evening, yes. She said, that's honest. He said, it's accurate. I try to make those the same thing. She said, 20 minutes. He said, 20 minutes. And then you go back to your assignments and I go back to my calls. She said, that's all this is. He said, yes. She said, just a conversation. He said, same as Tuesday. She said, Tuesday was an accident. He said, this is better. Accidents are interesting. Choices are more interesting. She looked at him for a moment longer. She said, the cafe on the west side of the lobby. The staff use it less than the main one. He said, I'll find it. She said, 5 minutes. I need to check in with the floor manager. He said, 5 minutes. She went. He walked to the west side of the lobby with the unhurried pace of a man who had somewhere to be and was not performing the arrival. She was there in 4 minutes. The cafe on the west side of the lobby was smaller than the main one, less visible. The kind of space that served good coffee without announcing it, and attracted the kind of people who had found it rather than been directed to it. He had a table in the corner which she noted, and 2 coffees already arrived, and she noted that also. She sat across from him. She said, "You remembered how I take it?" He said, "You told me Tuesday." She said, "I didn't tell you how I take my coffee on Tuesday." He said, "You're right. I asked the cafe." She stared at him. He said, "I described you. They know all the regular staff orders." She said, "You asked the cafe." He said, "You said details accumulate and you start to see the shape of a person through them. I'm accumulating details." She said, "You're building a picture." He said, "A starting point, not a conclusion." She looked at him. Something in her expression, not quite a smile, the thing before a smile, the decision a face makes when it's choosing between composure and warmth. She said, "You were listening." He said, "I always listen. It's the most useful thing a person can do in any situation." She said, "Most people in your position don't." He said, "Most people in my position have been told so many times that their ideas are interesting that they've stopped needing to hear anyone else's. I noticed that in myself at 30 and corrected for it." She said, "How?" He said, "I started asking more questions than I answered in meetings with clients He paused, every context. She said, "Even here." He said, "Especially here." She said, "Why especially?" He said, "Because here there's no professional framework telling me what the conversation is supposed to produce. I don't know what I'm getting. That requires actual listening rather than managed listening." She said, "You don't usually have conversations you don't manage." He said, "Almost never. It's a professional habit." She said, "And this," he said, "is something else." She drank her coffee. He drank his. The lobby moved around them, the particular controlled flow of a luxury hotel in the mid-afternoon, guests arriving and departing, staff moving with the quiet efficiency of a well-run system. She was part of that system. She was sitting outside it simultaneously. She said, "Tell me about Lagos." He said, "What aspect?" She said, "The version you go back to 6 weeks a year. What is it like?" He said, "Loud, immediate, the specific quality of a city that has no interest in curating itself for outside observation. What it is fully and without apology." She said, "You like that?" He said, "I'm from it. It's in my operating system." She said, "But you left." He said, "The work was everywhere except Lagos. In the early years I had to go where the opportunities were. Later I had the choice and I kept going because the going had become structural." She said, "Structural." He said, "Built into how I work, how I think. I design systems. I see myself as a system. The movement is a feature." She said, "You said that Tuesday also, that you'd made peace with the loneliness." He said, "Yes." She said, "Making peace with something isn't the same as wanting it." He said, "No, but it's better than wanting something you've decided you can't have and spending your energy on the wanting." She said, "Can't or won't." He said, "Both. They were the same decision made at the same time." She said, "When?" He said, 4 years ago. A relationship that ended because I was in 3 cities simultaneously. And the 3rd city was not the one she was in. And I hadn't made her a priority, and she told me very clearly and correctly that I had chosen the work over her without being honest about it, and she was right. She said, "You didn't argue." He said, "She was right." What was there to argue? She said, "Most people argue anyway." He said, "I know. I find that dishonest." She said, "So, you accepted it." He said, "I accepted it, and I decided that asking someone to exist in the margins of my work was unfair, and I stopped asking." She said, "And now?" He said, "Now I'm 36 and the work is extraordinary, and I am. She watched him find the word. Less certain that the margins were as small as I told myself they were. She said, the things you said you didn't need. He said, that you need and didn't know how to want correctly. Yes. She said, and now you know how to want them. He said, I'm learning. It's a slower process than I expected. She said, most things worth learning are. He said, your grandmother again. She said a lot of things worth remembering. He said, tell me about her. She said her name was Lolacita, short for Felicita. She was very small and very certain about everything, and she made decisions the way you do, I think. Quickly and without softening them for other people's comfort. He said, you think I'm like your grandmother? She said, in that specific way. He said, and other ways. She said, maybe. I've known you 20 minutes and one Tuesday. He said, what do you have so far? You said you start with a picture. She said, you want the picture? He said, yes. She said, you don't normally ask for this. He said, no. She said, why now? He said, because the person who walked through my door on Tuesday saw something in 14 minutes that most people don't see in a year. I want to know what she sees. She held his gaze, the direct, unhurried gaze that was her most characteristic quality. The thing guests noticed without always knowing they were noticing it. The quality of a woman who looked at things and told the truth about what she saw. She said, a man who is very good at distance because he built the distance deliberately. Who has spent 4 years inside a decision he made correctly at the time and is beginning to wonder if a correct decision at 32 is still the correct decision at 36. Who is honest in the way of people who were burned by the gap between what was said and what was true and have spent years closing that gap in themselves. He was quiet. She said, and who knocked on a wall he built and recently noticed it echoes. Long pause. He said, the echo. She said, when something is hollow it echoes, when it's full it doesn't. He said, and my wall. She said, is excellent construction, very solid, and echoes a little. He said, you got that from 20 minutes and one Tuesday. She said, and a coffee order, and the fact that you called the front desk about the keycard when you didn't have to. He said, the keycard keeps coming up. She said, small things tell the truth. You know that. You said it first. He said, I said details accumulate. She said, same principle. He looked at her, the full direct look that she had begun to understand as his most honest mode, the one that didn't perform consideration, that just considered. He said, floor. She said, yes. He said, I'm here for another 9 days. She said, I know. Your checkout is on the system. He said, I'd like to. He stopped. Found the right construction. I'd like to have this conversation again. She said, a third conversation. He said, a third one and possibly more. She said, in the lobby cafe. He said, or somewhere that isn't the hotel if you're more comfortable. If that's better for your position here. She said, you've thought about my position more than most guests do. He said, your position matters. You've built something here. I'm not going to be the reason it becomes complicated. She said, you're careful with other people's things. He said, I try to be. She said, that's not small. He said, no. She looked at her watch. 17 minutes. She said, I should go. He said, I know. She stood. He stood. The small natural geography of departure. She said, tomorrow I have a late shift. It ends at 9. She said it looking at the table rather than at him. The particular quality of a woman offering something without quite offering it, leaving the door open without walking through it herself. He said, there's a place on the creek, not a hotel, actual Dubai. It's open until midnight. She said, that sounds like somewhere you've been. He said, Saturday mornings when I can manage them. It's the most honest place in the city. She said, you collect honest places. He said, I collect honest things. She looked up. He was looking at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize, the full attention. The one that had been there in the suite and had not gone anywhere since. She said, 9:15. He said, I'll find it before then. She said, I know you will. She picked up her service kit from beside the chair where she had set it. The quiet signal of a woman who knew exactly what context she was in and was not confused about it, who was choosing this thing with both eyes open. She walked back toward the staff corridor. He watched her go. He thought about the creek at 9:15 and the particular quality of a city being itself without apology, and a woman who had walked into the wrong room and looked at him like he was a person rather than a guest, and said the truest thing anyone had said to him in 4 years. He thought, hollow things echo and full things don't. He thought, 9 days. He thought enough time for things to change direction. He went back upstairs, back to his calls, back to the Gulf expansion, back to the beautiful, complicated work that had taken him everywhere and given him everything except the one thing his wall had recently started to echo about. He dialed into the afternoon session. He was present. He was professional. He was exactly who the client needed him to be. Underneath all of it, very quietly, he was also counting the hours to 9:15. The creek at night was the version of Dubai that the hotels didn't show you. Not because it was hidden, because it required the decision to look past the obvious. The Al Seef district had the particular quality of a place that had been preserved rather than invented, old trading district architecture along the waterfront. The specific sound of a city that had been doing business at this particular bend in the water for centuries, before anyone thought to put glass towers beside it. He was there at 9 when she arrived at 9:14. She was not in uniform. He had seen her in 3 contexts: the suite, the lift, the cafe. In all 3, she had the particular self-contained quality that went with service work. The professional composure that was its own kind of uniform regardless of what you were wearing. Out of the hotel, she was something else also. Not different. More. The way a room looks different when all the lights are on rather than just some of them. She was wearing something simple, dark, her hair down, which he had not seen before. She had the specific quality of a woman who had changed her clothes but not her bearing, still upright, still clear, still looking at the world directly. She saw him. He raised one hand. She walked over. She said, "You found it." He said, "I always find what I'm looking for." She said, "Is that a general statement?" He said, "Yes." She looked at him. The corner of her mouth. He said, "Sit down, Flor." She sat. They were outside. The creek moved beside them, the sound of it and the smell of it, salt and trade and the long accumulated weight of a place that had known what it was for a long time. Above them, the sky was the particular Dubai night sky, which was darker than you expected given the lights below because the desert ate light differently than other landscapes. She said, "This is real." He said, "Yes." She said, "The hotel is very beautiful." He said, "It is." She said, "But it's not real in the way this is real." He said, "No. The hotel is excellent. This is." He searched itself. She said, "Yes." He said, "I find hotels easier to exist in than people expect. They're controlled environments. Everything has a protocol." "I understand protocols," she said, "and outside the hotel," he said, "outside the hotel I have to operate without the protocol. It's less efficient." She said, "Is that bad?" He said, "It's uncomfortable. Uncomfortable isn't the same as bad." She said, "No, it isn't." She looked at the creek. He looked at her looking at it. He said, "Tell me what you see." She said, "The water, the old buildings, the way the lights from the new towers on the other side land on the surface and the surface doesn't care." He said, "The surface doesn't care." She said, "Water is indifferent to what reflects in it. It just is. I find that restful." He said, Like London for the person who wanted to earn the city's attention rather than receive it. She said, "You remembered that." He said, "I remember everything you've said." She said, "We've had 3 conversations." He said, "Yes, I remember all of them." She said, "That's..." She paused. "Specific." He said, "It's honest." She said, "Most people wouldn't say that." He said, "I know." She turned from the water and looked at him. The full, clear look. The one that saw things. She said, "Elias." He said, "Yes." She said, "You have 9 days." He said, 8 now. She said, 8 days and then you go back to everywhere. He said, "Yes." She said, "And I stay here." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's a complicated arithmetic." He said, "I know." She said, "So what is this?" He said, "Honest question." She said, "Yes." He said, "I don't know yet." She said, "That's not like you." He said, "No, it isn't." He looked at the water. "Usually I know exactly what a thing is before I engage with it. I don't know what this is. I know that I've thought about you since Tuesday, and I know that I wanted to be here tonight more than I've wanted to be anywhere in a long time. The category I don't have yet." She said, "I don't have it either." He said, "Does that bother you?" She said, "It surprises me." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because I'm usually very good at categories." He said, "So am I." She said, "And yet." He said, "And yet." The creek moved. The city glittered on both sides. Somewhere a boat went past slowly, its running lights reflected in the water below, which received the light and moved on. She said, "Elias." He said, "Yes." She said, 8 days is not nothing." He said, "No." She said, "And Dubai is not the last city. You said the Gulf expansion." He said, "I'll be back regularly for at least the next year." She said, "You're not promising anything." He said, "I'm telling you a fact. I'm constitutionally opposed to promising things I can't guarantee. Facts I can give you. Guarantees I can't." She said, "The fact is, you'll be back." He said, "Yes." She said, "Regularly." He said, "Yes." She said, "And in 8 days." He said, "In 8 days I want to have had more than 3 conversations and 1 evening at the creek." She said, "What do you want to have had?" He said, "Everything you're willing to give, which I recognize is entirely your decision and I have no expectation about the scope of it." She said, "That's very careful phrasing." He said, "I'm a careful man." She said, "I've noticed." He said, "What have you noticed specifically?" She said, "The key card, the coffee order, the West Side Cafe. This." She gestured at the table, the creek, the whole careful architecture of an evening built for her comfort rather than his convenience. "You think ahead for other people. Most people think ahead for themselves." He said, "It's practical. If the people around you are comfortable, the situation is better for everyone." She said, "That's the practical version." He said, "What's the other version?" She said, "That you care how people feel, even when it's not efficient to care." He said nothing for a moment. He said, "Yes." She said, "That's the most personal thing you've said." He said, "It's the most exposed thing. There's a difference." She said, "Why exposed?" He said, "Caring about how people feel in environments that have historically treated caring as a vulnerability is a risk management problem. I've resolved it by being selective about what I show and where." She said, "And here?" He said, "Here I'm outside the hotel and I've known you since an accidental Tuesday and there's a creek beside us and I've been alone for 4 years. The usual risk management feels less relevant than usual." She said, "Is that good?" He said, "Ask me in 8 days." She almost smiled. The thing before the smile, warm at the edges. He said, "Floor." She said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you for coming." She said, "Thank you for finding the honest place." He said, "Every city has one. You just have to look past the obvious." She said, "Most people don't." He said, "Most people are looking for comfort. I've always been more interested in true She said, I know. He said, you keep saying that. She said, you keep being right. He said, we're going to argue about that eventually. She said, probably. He said, good. Means it's real. She said, did I say that? He said, Tuesday. Difficulty is evidence of authenticity. She said, you remember everything. He said, everything worth remembering. She looked at him across the table. The creek moved beside them. 8 days. An arithmetic she didn't have a category for yet. A man who thought ahead for other people and called it practical and meant something more than practical, and knew that she knew the difference. She said, same time tomorrow. He said, yes. She said, somewhere else, honest. He said, I know a place. She said, of course you do. He said, good night, Flor. She said, good night, Elias. She walked back along the creek toward the metro. He watched her go with the particular attention of a man who has found something he didn't know he was looking for and is being very careful not to mishandle the finding. The water moved. The city glittered. 8 days began to feel for the first time like enough time to start something worth continuing. He was not a man who made promises he couldn't guarantee. But some facts were close enough to promises that the difference barely mattered. He was coming back. She was here. The creek knew things that hotels didn't. That was enough for tonight to begin. The second evening was a spice market. Not a tourist version of a spice market. Not the curated, photographable kind that existed for the benefit of people who wanted the idea of a souk without the actual density of one. Elias had found the real one in the older part of Dara, where the narrow lanes between the stalls created their own particular atmosphere of accumulated warmth. And the air carried turmeric and dried rose and cardamom in layers that landed differently depending on which direction the evening wind came from. Flor arrived to find him already inside the lanes, standing in front of a stall that sold saffron in quantities that suggested it was supplying restaurants rather than households, talking to the vendor in the particular way of a man who was genuinely curious rather than performing curiosity. She watched him for a moment before he noticed her. She had been doing this, she realized, watching him before he noticed. Collecting the unmanaged version. He turned, saw her. The quality of his face when he saw her was something she was beginning to catalog separately from everything else. It wasn't performed welcome. It was the specific expression of a person who had been waiting for something and is now confirmed that the waiting was correctly placed. She said, "You found an honest place." He said, "The most honest place in Dubai. Every city has a spice market. This one is real." She said, "How do you find these things?" He said, "I walk. When I have time in a new city, I walk until I find the version of it that isn't performing." She said, "That takes time." He said, "Most worthwhile things do." She stood beside him at the saffron stall. The vendor looked at both of them with the unsurprised patience of a man who had seen many combinations of people pass through his lane, and had concluded long ago that people were people and saffron was saffron and everything else was detail. She said, "Do you cook?" He said, "Badly. My mother taught me." The intention was better than the execution. She said, "What do you make?" He said, "Whatever she made when I was 7 and the kitchen smelled like something was right with the world." She said, "Jollof." He said, "You know it." She said, "I have Filipino friends in Dubai. Half of them are married to Nigerians. The jollof argument reaches me regularly." He said, "What argument?" She said, "Nigerian versus Ghanaian. I'm told it's significant." He said, "It is significant. The Nigerian version is correct." She said, "You're very certain," he said, "about jollof, always." She almost smiled. The thing before the smile. He had started to look for it specifically the moment her composure softened at the edges and something warmer came through. He said, "What do you cook?" She said, "My grandmother's recipes." She had a way with fish that I've spent 6 years trying to replicate, and I'm about 70% of the way there. He said, what's the missing 30%? She said, her. She said it simply, without performance of grief, just as fact. The ingredient isn't the fish or the vinegar or the ginger, it's her hands doing it. That part I can't replicate. He was quiet for a moment. He said, my mother's jollof is the same. I can follow the recipe exactly. It's never the same. She said, because it's her. He said, yes. They walked the lane slowly, not with a destination, just with the particular unhurried quality of two people who were using the movement of a walk to give the conversation room. Stalls of dried herbs, frankincense in amber chunks, whole dried limes that smelled of something ancient and specific. The market had the quality of a place that had been doing this same thing long enough that the doing had become its own form of dignity. She said, tell me about the company, not the business facts, the reason. He said, the reason I built it. She said, yes. He said, when I was 22, I was working for a logistics firm in Lagos. We had an international system we'd licensed from a European company that was genuinely excellent for European supply chains and genuinely inadequate for ours. The roads were different. The payment infrastructure was different. The vendor relationships were different, and every time we flagged an inadequacy, the response was to adjust our processes to fit the system rather than adjust the system to fit our processes. She said, you adjusted the other direction. He said, I built something that understood the problem it was actually solving rather than the problem it had been designed to solve somewhere else. That's the whole idea. Stop importing solutions for other people's problems and build one for yours. She said, and it worked. He said, it worked because the need was genuine. I didn't invent the problem, I just paid attention to it. She said, you pay attention. He said, it's the most useful thing a person can do. I've said this before. She said, you said it to me. Do you say it generally? He said, in business, yes, in. He paused. Other contexts, I've been less good at it. She said, the relationship. He said, she told me I was present physically and absent in every way that mattered. She wasn't wrong. She said, were you paying attention to the wrong things? He said, I was paying attention to the work and assuming the relationship could sustain itself on the remainder. She said, and it couldn't. He said, no thing worth having sustains itself on remainders. I understood that about my company. I failed to understand it about her, she said, and now. He said, now I understand it about everything. The understanding didn't come with a solution, which is the frustrating part. Knowing what you did wrong doesn't automatically equip you to do it right. She said, no. But it's where the right starts. He said, your grandmother again. Your grandmother. She said, just me this time. He looked at her. They had stopped walking without choosing to. In the middle of a lane between a cardamom stall and a display of dried flowers the color of old gold. He said, just you. She said, I've made my share of decisions that were correct at the time and wrong later. I know what it feels like to be right about the wrong thing. He said, what decision? She said, coming here, to Dubai. He said, you said you liked it. She said, I like it. I also came here because there was a person in Cebu I was trying to stop thinking about and distance seemed like the solution. He said, did it work? She said, not the way I expected. I stopped thinking about the person and started thinking about whether I'd made the decision for the right reason. Those are different problems, he said. And, she said, the reason was wrong. The result was right. Dubai built me something I wouldn't have built in Cebu. He said, the work. She said, the person. She said it quietly. Said it. Distance doesn't fix things, but it creates space. In the space I found out what I was actually made of. He said, and what are you made of? She said, more than I thought, and less fragile than I was worried. He said, that's a good thing to find out. She said, yes. He said, floor. She said, yes. He said, the person in Cebu. She said, is a long time ago. I'm not carrying it. I'm just, she thought, using it as evidence of what I know now that I didn't know then. He said, what do you know now? She said, that distance isn't avoidance if you use it to build something. That being good at your own company is not the same as being satisfied with it. That small things tell the truth about large things. He said, the keycard principle. She said, yes. He said, you've named it. She said, someone named the Bernays principle. I'm keeping the tradition. He looked at her. Something moved in his expression. The warm thing she had now seen enough times to recognize. The thing that existed underneath the controlled exterior of a man who had learned to be sufficient, and was in the process of remembering why sufficient wasn't the whole story. He said, come on. He walked. She walked beside him. The market continued its ancient, aromatic, indifferent business around them. She thought about small things and what they told about large things. She thought about a man who had built a solution for problems that had been ignored by people who weren't paying attention. She thought about 8 days and an arithmetic without a category. She thought, this is the 7th evening I have spent in a city I have lived in for 4 years, and found it more interesting than any of the previous evenings in those 4 years. She thought, that is evidence of something. She thought, I know what it's evidence of. She wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, but she knew. The 3rd evening was the creek again. Different table, same water. The particular quality of a place they had agreed without discussing it was theirs in the specific way that places become yours when you have returned to them with intention. He brought dates and coffee from a stall he had found nearby. She brought nothing because she had worked a 10-hour shift and arrived 4 minutes late and slightly breathless, and he looked at her and said, sit. She sat. She said, you didn't have to. He said, you've been on your feet since noon. She said, how do you know when my shifts start? He said, you told me the first evening. She said, that was the hotel cafe. I said, late shift. He said, late shift at your hotel starts at noon on weekdays. I asked, she said, you asked the hotel. He said, the front desk is very informative. She said, you're building the picture. He said, details accumulate. She looked at him, the long look, the one she used when something had moved her that she wasn't quite ready to show being moved by. She said, Elias. He said, yes. She said, don't do things that are hard to hold. He said, what do you mean? She said, the coffee order, the dates. Asking the front desk when my shift starts. Each one individually is a small thing. He said, and together. She said, together they accumulate into something that a person has to decide what to do with. He said, is that bad? She said, it's not bad, it's... She thought, significant. He said, I told you Tuesday, this is not light. She said, I know, that's what I'm telling you, I know. He said, and. She said, and I'm deciding what to do with it. He said, take your time. She said, we have 6 days. He said, yes. She said, that's not a lot of time to decide something significant. He said, no. But it's enough time to know whether the significant thing is real or circumstantial. She said, is there a difference? He said, a significant thing that only exists in specific conditions isn't significant, it's situational. She said, and how do you test for the difference? He said, you look at how you feel about the person in the ordinary moments. Not the creek, not the market, the lift, the West Side Cafe. The moment in the presidential suite when they said something you didn't expect. She said, the 14 minutes. He said, yes. She said, you already know then. He said, I told you on the first evening. I've been certain since Tuesday. She said, that's fast. He said, I make decisions quickly when I have enough information. She said, and you had enough information in 14 minutes. He said, I had the core data. The edges I'm still filling in. She said, what are the edges? He said, everything I don't know yet. Which is most things. She said, that doesn't bother you. He said, the unknown is where the work is. I've never been afraid of work. She said, this isn't a system you're building. He said, no. It's harder and more interesting. She looked at the water. He looked at her looking at the water. She said, I like you. She said it the way she said things, directly and without the surrounding cushion of softening language. Just the fact, placed between them. He said, I know. She said, does everyone who likes you know that you know? He said, no. Usually I don't say it. She said, why with me? He said, because you said a true thing without armor and it deserved a true thing back. She said, that's fair. He said, I like you also. Significantly, since the suite. She said, you were alone in that suite for 11 days before I walked in. He said, yes. She said, and you noticed me in 14 minutes. He said, 8. The first 6, I was confirming the initial assessment. She said, and the initial assessment was, he said, that you were the most self-possessed person I'd encountered in a long time. She said, self-possessed. He said, you walked into a stranger's suite at the wrong floor and within 4 seconds you understood exactly what had happened, what the appropriate response was and what your position should be. No panic, no performance, just clear, immediate competence. And then when I asked you to stay, you stayed without pretending you weren't making a choice. She said most people would have just left. He said, yes. She said, I almost did. He said, I know. She said, what made you think I wouldn't? He said, the way you looked at me when I said you're exactly where you belong. She said, how did I look? He said, like you were deciding whether the thing was what it sounded like or what it meant. And you took the time to decide rather than reacting to the sound. She said, and what did you mean? He said, that the universe had arranged something that looked like an error and might be something else entirely. I meant it exactly that way. She said, not the other way. He said, I was alone in that suite by choice for reasons I believed were correct. I was not looking for anything. And then something walked through my door and I said a thing I hadn't planned to say and I meant it. She said the keycard principle. He said, yes, truest things come before the decision to say them. She looked at him, long, the full, clear, honest look. She said 6 days. He said, yes. She said, I don't want to spend them being careful. He said, neither do I. She said, but I also don't want to spend them pretending the arithmetic isn't what it is. He said, you mean the distance after? She said, you go back to everywhere, I stay here, that's real. He said, it's real and it's also not the whole picture. She said, what's the rest? He said, I'm here regularly. The Gulf expansion runs at least another year. I'll be in Dubai 6-7 times at minimum. That's not a promise, it's a fact. She said, and between Dubai, he said, between Dubai I'll be in Lagos and London and Singapore and Nairobi. Yes. She said, that's a lot of between. He said, it is. She said, most people would make it smaller than it is. He said, I told you. I'm constitutionally opposed to promising what I can't guarantee. She said, I know. He said, but I can tell you what I know. Which is that in 20 years of doing this work, I have felt about specific things and specific people and specific moments the way I have felt about this week. That number is small. She said, how small? He said, the work, my mother. 2 or 3 moments I could name. And this. She said, that's honest. He said, it's all I have. She said, Elias. He said, yes. She said, I've been in Dubai for 4 years and I haven't looked at anything the way I've looked at this week. He said, I know. She said, I'm not experienced at this kind of thing. The distance kind. The arithmetic kind. He said, neither am I. We'll be working it out together. Out? She said, that's not a comforting plan. He said, it's an honest one. She said, I know. That's why I'm still at this table. He reached across the table, placed his hand over hers. His hand, large and deliberate, the hand of a man who built things and meant what he touched. She looked down at it, then up at him. She turned her hand over. He closed his around it. The creek moved beside them. Dubai glittered. Two people sat at a table that had become theirs in 4 evenings and held the specific weight of something that neither of them had a complete plan for, and both of them had decided was worth the uncertainty. She said, tomorrow is my day off. He said, yes. She said, show me something I haven't seen, he said, in Dubai. She said, you've been finding honest places. Show me one I don't know. He said, I'll need to find one first. She said, you have until tomorrow morning. He said, I'll be ready. She said, I know you will. The 4th day was a dhow. He had chartered a traditional wooden boat for the morning. Not the tourist version with the dinner buffet and the commentary, but a working dhow whose captain was a man named Rashid, who had been sailing the creek and the Gulf for 40 years, and had the particular quality of someone who understood the water in the way that only comes from a life spent on it. Rashid spoke limited English and Elias spoke no Arabic, and they communicated with the efficient gestures of two men who respected competence in each other regardless of the language gap. Fleur arrived at the dock in the early morning to find Elias already there talking to Rashid through a combination of pointing and the universal language of two people who both knew boats, which was apparently a language Elias spoke more fluently than she had expected. She said, you know boats. He said, Lagos is on the ocean. I grew up near water. She said, do you sail? He said, badly. Like the Jollof. The intention is better than the execution. She laughed. The real one, short and unguarded, the one she never intended. He caught it, filed it. He was running out of space for the things he was filing about her. He was filing them anyway. The dhow moved out onto the creek slowly. The morning had the quality that early Dubai mornings had before the heat arrived, cool and clear. The light coming in at a low angle that made the water the color of old silver. Rashid sat at the back with the ease of a man who had sat in that position for 40 years and had forgotten it was notable. Fleur sat at the bow. Elias sat beside her. She said, how did you find this? He said, I walked until I found the honest place. Then I asked the honest place where the next honest thing was. She said, and it led you here. He said, via 3 other stops. But yes. She said, you did all of this last night. He said, you said, show me something you haven't seen. I take assignments seriously. She said, it wasn't an assignment. He said, everything is an assignment if you approach it correctly. She said, Elias. He said, yes. She said, that might be the most you thing you've ever said. He said, is that bad? She said, no. It's... She looked at him. The warm look. The one that was entirely real. It's you. I like that it's you. He looked at her. The creek moving them slowly. Rashid behind them, uninterested in anything except the water ahead. He said, I've been thinking about something. She said, tell me. He said, you said small things tell the truth about large things, the keycard principle. She said, yes. He said, I want to know the small things about you, the ones that tell the truth about the large ones. She said, you've been accumulating. He said, the picture isn't complete. I want more of the edges. She said, what do you want to know? He said, something nobody asks you. She said, that's a broad category. He said, then something nobody has thought to ask. She thought about it. The creek moved. The light shifted as a cloud went somewhere and came back. She said, I write letters. He said, letters. She said, physical ones. To my mother. Every 2 weeks since I moved to Dubai. 4 pages handwritten on the same kind of paper because she said the feel of it matters more than the content. She reads them twice. Once fast and once slow. She told me that. Fast to know everything is all right. Slow to actually hear me. He said, "You've sent letters for 4 years." She said 96 letters, give or take. He said, "Does she write back?" She said texts. She's 72 and texts like she's 20. Full punctuation, proper grammar, no abbreviations. She thinks abbreviations are rude. He said, "She's right." She said, "I know." He said, "Your mother and my mother would be very good friends." She said, "I think so too." He said, "Tell me another small thing." She said, "I keep a list." He said, "Of what?" She said, "Specific moments, not journal entries, just the moment itself written in one sentence. The first time I saw the creek at night. The evening Rashid is going to take us back in." She paused. "Tuesday." He was quiet. She said, "Small things tell the truth." He said, "Yes." He said, "Floor." She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to be on the list." She said, "You're already on the list." He said, "Since Tuesday." She said, "Since Tuesday." He said, "What's the sentence?" She said, "A man said you're exactly where you belong," and meant something entirely different from what it sounded like, and I stayed anyway. He said, "That's 2 sentences." She said, "It needed the space." He reached over and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face. The creek wind had been doing what creek winds do, and she had been letting it. His hand careful at the side of her face. She went very still. He said, "I'd like to be on more of the list." She said, "You will be." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because I've been paying attention since Tuesday, and everything I've paid attention to has been worth writing down." He said, "That's..." He stopped. He searched. "Significant." She said, "You used my word." He said, "It's the right word." She turned her face slightly into his hand, the instinctive movement of a person toward warmth they have stopped resisting. He felt it. His thumb moved just once along the line of her cheekbone. She said quietly, "Elias." He said, "Yes." She said, "The creek is very beautiful." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm not looking at it." He said, "Neither am I." Rashid behind them continued his ancient relationship with the water, uninterested and serene. The dhow moved. The light landed on the surface, and the surface kept moving. 2 people sat at the bow of a 40-year-old boat in the early morning and let something happen that had been happening slowly and honestly since an accidental Tuesday in November. He leaned forward. She tilted her chin, the specific geometry of a decision that had been accumulating through 4 evenings and a dhow and 96 letters and a list of moments and small things that told the truth about large ones. He kissed her the way she had come to understand he would. Carefully, completely, without performing it. The same quality he brought to everything, which was full attention and nothing wasted. She put her hand against his chest. Felt the warmth of him through the fabric. Felt him exhale. The creek moved them gently. Rashid did not look up from the water. The morning was still cool and silver and entirely itself. When they stepped back, she looked at him. He looked at her, his hand still at her face. She said, 5 days? He said, yes. She said, we should use them well. He said, I intend to. She said, not the hotel. He said, no. Honest places. She said, as many as you can find. He said, I'll need you to help find some. She said, I've been here 4 years. I know a few. He said, show me. She said, tomorrow. He said, tomorrow. She leaned back into the morning and let the creek carry them and thought about the sentence she would add to the list when she got home. She was already composing it. She had been composing it since the first moment on the dhow, the way she composed the letters to her mother. Slowly and honestly and with the full weight of what was actually true. She thought, the most precise sentence for the most real morning. She thought, she's going to read this one twice. The days narrowed. 5 became 4. 4 became 3. They did not discuss the narrowing. They moved through the time with the specific quality of two people who have both decided that spending time being sad about the end of something is a waste of the thing itself. She showed him the parts of Dubai she had collected in 4 years. The workers' district near Al-Quaz, where the real city lived, far from the hotels and towers, the part that built everything and was rarely included in the official picture. The temple in Bur Dubai, small and precisely kept, where she went sometimes on her mornings off to sit in a kind of quiet that had a different quality from other kinds of quiet. The Indian grocery near her apartment building, where the owner, a Keralite man named Thomas, had been recommending products to her for 3 years with such reliability that she had stopped making decisions about unfamiliar ingredients and simply asked Thomas. He met Thomas. Thomas assessed him with the particular efficiency of a man who had been assessing people across a counter for 20 years and said in Malayalam something to the woman behind the counter that made her laugh. Fleur asked what he'd said. Thomas said, "I told her he looks like someone who came looking for something specific and found it by accident." Elias said, "That's accurate." Thomas said, "Good. Buy the black cardamom. She'll know what to do with it." He bought the black cardamom. She accepted it without ceremony and put it in her bag. Small things. She showed him her apartment building's rooftop, which was not a designed rooftop, not an Instagrammable space, just a flat surface with an old water tank and a view that was better than anyone had planned because the buildings around it had grown in directions nobody predicted and left a gap that looked straight out at the desert's edge on one side and the towers on the other. He stood at the gap and looked at both directions for a long time. He said, "This is the most honest view I've seen in Dubai." She said, "I know. That's why I come here." He said, "How often?" She said, "When I need to remember what's real and what's constructed." He said, "And which direction is which?" She said, "The desert is real, the towers are constructed, both are Dubai. You need to see both to understand the place." He said, "You've understood this city." She said, 4 years. Details accumulate. He said, "You said that about people." She said, "Same principle. Cities are people at scale." He turned from the view and looked at her. The rooftop wind was doing what rooftop winds do, which was ignore all preferences and move freely in all directions. She had her arms crossed against it. He was looking at her with the full look, the cataloging one, the one that was filing the last available details before the filing had to stop. She said, "Don't." He said, "Don't what?" She said, "Don't look like that, like you're memorizing." He said, "I am memorizing." She said, "I know. But it makes the arithmetic present and I'm not ready to make it present yet." He said, "Floor." She said, "Yes." He said, "We have 2 days." She said, "I know." He said, "After 2 days, I go to Nairobi for a week and then I'm in London for 3. And then," she said, "Dubai?" He said, "Dubai. I'll be back." She said, "I know." He said, "And between?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm going to call you." She said, "I know." He said, "More than is probably strategically reasonable." She said, "I don't think this has ever been about strategy." He said, "No, it hasn't." She said, "That's new for you." He said, "Completely." She said, "How does it feel?" He said, "Uncomfortable and correct, and not something I'm willing to walk back from." She looked at him. The wind, the view of the desert and the towers, the specific quality of an evening that was almost the last one. She said, "Come here." He crossed the rooftop, stood in front of her, close. The specific closeness they had found their way to through a dhow and a market and 4 evenings at the creek, the closeness that was no longer careful in the way of people managing distance, but simply present in the way of people who have stopped needing to manage it. She put her hands on his chest. He put his arms around her. The wind continued its indifferent rooftop business, she said against his shoulder. You're going to be terrible at calling. He said initially, yes. She said, and then? He said, then I'll find a protocol for it. I'm good at building protocols. She said, you're going to build a calling protocol. He said, an efficient one, accounting for time zones and shift schedules and the specific quality of what you need from a conversation. She said, you're going to research what I need from a conversation. He said, I'm going to pay attention, which is the same thing. She said, Elias. He said, yes. She said, I'm going to write you letters. He said, physical ones. She said, yes. He said, I'll need an address. She said, you'll get one. He said, one sentence per moment. She said, more than one sentence for the moments that need the space. He said, yes. He pulled her closer. She let him. The rooftop held them both. Dubai spread out in its dual truth, desert and towers, real and constructed, all of it genuine in its own way. All of it the place that had taken 4 years to give her something worth writing down more than once. She thought, 96 letters to her mother and not one of them about this specific feeling. She thought, the 97th is going to be different. She thought, she's going to read this one more than twice. The last evening they went back to the creek. Not because they had discussed it, because they both arrived at the same conclusion independently, and when she texted him the location, he had already been heading there for 20 minutes. The table was the same. Theirs now in the full sense. The creek was the same. The city glittered and the water moved, and neither of them was looking at any of it. She said, tomorrow at what time? He said, 6 in the morning. She said, that's early. He said, early flights to Nairobi. She said, I have a shift at 8. He said, I know. She said, so this is. He said, yes. She said, we've had 8 evenings. He said, 7 and a dow. She said, 7 and a dow. He said, and 1 accidental Tuesday. She said, that one was the beginning. He said, yes. She said, you said you're exactly where you belong. He said, I meant it and I mean it now. She looked at him across the table, the full look, the honest one. The one she had been giving him since a presidential suite and a wrong key and a man who hadn't requested turn-down service and had asked her to stay anyway. She said, I'm glad the system made an error. He said, I'm glad you didn't notice until after you'd already knocked. She said, I said, good evening, I'm here for your turn-down service. He said, and I said I didn't request turn-down service. She said, and I looked up. He said, and I saw someone who wanted nothing from me. She said, and you said stay. He said, like a fact. She said, and I stayed. He said, 14 minutes. She said, best 14 minutes. He said, the starting point. She said, not the conclusion. He said, not even close to the conclusion. She said, Elias. He said, yes. She said, don't say goodbye. He said, I wasn't planning to. She said, what were you planning to say? He said, good night, because that's accurate. I'm going to see you in 6 weeks. Good night is the right word. She said, 6 weeks. He said, I'll be back before the expansion closes its second phase. That's scheduled for mid-January. She said, mid-January in Dubai. He said, yes. She said, that's 8 weeks. He said, 6 if the timeline holds, 8 if it doesn't. She said, I'll plan for 8. He said, and hope for 6. She said, yes. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. The creek moved. The city did its illuminated, constructed, genuine, honest, dual truth thing all around them. He said, I'm going to send you something from Nairobi. She said, what? He said, a small thing. The kind that tells the truth about a large one. She said, you're learning the keycard principle. He said, I've been learning it since Tuesday. She said, you're a fast learner when the subject interests you. He said, you interest me, more than anything has in 4 years. She said, 4 years is a long time. He said, yes, it is. She said, and you've decided in 8 days. He said, 7 and a dow. She said, and the 14 minutes. He said the 14 minutes were most of the decision, the rest was confirmation. She said, confirmation from. He said, every time you said a true thing without checking first whether it was convenient. Every time you looked at something directly without softening it for your own comfort. Every time I realized you were watching me before I noticed, and the watching was honest rather than evaluative. She said, I was building the picture. He said, I know, I was building one of you too. She said, and, he said, complete enough to know I want to keep adding to it for a long time. She said, that's a large thing. He said, yes, a large thing preceded by a long accumulation of small ones. She said, the keycard principle. He said, yes. She stood. He stood, the natural language of the end of an evening that was also the beginning of a different shape of thing. He walked around the table, stood in front of her. She looked up at him, the creek at her back, the city everywhere. He said, floor. She said, yes. He said, you walked into the wrong room. She said, yes. He said, and you were exactly where you belonged. She said, I know. He said, I know you know. She said, then stop talking. He kissed her the way he had on the dow and the ways he had since the dow, carefully and completely and with the full quality of attention that was his most honest thing. She put her hands against him and felt the warmth of a man who had been alone for 4 years and was no longer willing to be as alone as he had been. Not because the aloneness had broken him, but because something had walked through a door with a wrong key and said good evening and looked up and made the aloneness suddenly seem like a very unnecessary amount of distance from something real. When they stepped back, the creek was still moving. It was always still moving. The creek had been moving for centuries before either of them and would continue long after and did not require their presence to do it. But for this specific moment on this specific evening, it was moving beside two people who had found each other in the honest way, which was accidentally and then deliberately and then honestly and then with the full weight of something that had decided to be more than a circumstance. She said, good night, Elias. He said, good night, Floor. She said, 6 weeks. He said, 6 weeks. She walked. He stayed at the table for a moment. Watched her go the way he had learned to watch her, which was with the full attention of a man who understood now that attention was not surveillance. It was care, and he had a great deal of it to give. He had simply for 4 years been giving it entirely to the wrong places. She disappeared around the edge of the creek path. He sat back down, looked at the water. He thought about a woman who wrote 96 letters with full punctuation on paper her mother could feel, who kept a list of moments in single sentences that needed the space, who had looked at a stranger's suite and understood the situation in 4 seconds and made a choice to stay anyway and been honest about it being a choice. He thought about 6 weeks. He thought about Nairobi in the morning and London after that and the specific calibration of a schedule that had never had to account for anything it couldn't move, and was now going to have to account for this. He thought, I have built systems for problems more complicated than this. He thought, none of them have mattered the way this one does. He thought about a small thing he would send from Nairobi, already composing it. Already looking for the honest thing that told the truth about the larger one, because she had taught him that and he was a fast learner when the subject interested him. He stood. The creek moved. Dubai glittered. He went back to the hotel that was not his home to prepare for the morning flight to a city that was not his home either, with the specific difference that this time the everywhere felt different. Not smaller. Not resolved. Just accompanied by the knowledge that somewhere in the same city there was a woman writing a sentence on good paper about a Dow and a spice market and a creek at night. 4 pages of it, 4 honest pages about what 4 years and 8 evenings and 7 and a Dow had built. and that when he came back in 6 weeks or 8, she would be here. And the creek would still be moving. And the wrong suite would have been, in the end, exactly the right one. Because some errors aren't errors, some of them are the universe paying attention when you aren't. And a woman named Flor had walked through a door with a wrong key and looked up. And a man named Elias had said stay like it was a fact. And the creek had moved and Dubai had glittered, and 8 evenings had become the kind of beginning that doesn't have an end in sight and doesn't need one. Just the next honest place, just the next small thing, just the accumulation of both, building towards something neither of them had a complete category for yet, and both of them had decided was worth the building. The water moved. The city held its lights against the dark. Somewhere on the metro going home, a woman opened a notebook and wrote one sentence on the first line of a new page and looked at it for a long moment and decided it needed more space than one sentence. She wrote 4. And then she wrote 4 pages. And then she sealed it in an envelope addressed to a woman in Cebu who read things twice. And she went to sleep thinking about 6 weeks and thinking about how 6 weeks had never felt so short and so completely worth waiting for. The creek knew what it was. So did she.